Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. This is fascinating. This is over on The Hill, you know, the newspaper, The Hill. Defense by John Bowden, excuse me. Defense Secretary James Mattis was caught off guard and appalled. That's pretty strong language coming from, you know, the Secretary of Defense, the guy in charge of the Armed Forces of America. Appalled by President Trump's announcement that he was banning transgender people from serving in the military, according to a New York Times report. Mattis, who was on vacation at the time of Trump's decision, only had 1 day's notice before Trump tweeted his announcement. Sources, according to the New York Times, sources close to the defense secretary told the Times that Mattis was infuriated by the tweets and saw them as an insult to transgender Americans currently serving in the military. Mattis, according to the Times, had been quietly lobbying Republicans for months to defeat a Republican-led amendment to the 2017 spending bill that would prevent the military from spending money on transition surgery or hormone therapy for transgender service members. The report states that Mattis initially resisted the initial policy allowing transgender Americans to serve, but accepted that the policy was to remain in place. His predecessor, the former Defense Secretary, Ash Carter, ripped the Trump administration for reversing the Obama administration's policies. Pretty important stuff, pretty amazing stuff, actually. In 1917, this was interesting, a silent protest, Chad Williams at Brandeis University wrote this op-ed. A silent protest parade in 1917 set the stage for civil rights marches. The only sounds were those of muffled drums, the shuffling of feet, and the gentle sobs of some of the estimated 20,000 onlookers. The women and children all wore white. The men were all dressed in black. It was July 28th, that's today, 1917, nearly 10,000 African Americans marched down Fifth Avenue, New York City, in silence to protest racial violence and white supremacy in the United States. New York City and the nation had never before witnessed such a remarkable scene. The silent protest parade, as it came to be known, was the first mass African-American demonstration of its kind and marked a watershed moment in the history of the civil rights movement. Chad Williams wrote a book called Torchbearers of Democracy, and in it he profiles this. The remarkable, remarkable story. I have an article that is going to be published tomorrow on Alternet that I wanted to share pieces of with you. It is titled, "The Past 5 Presidents Have Used Fraud and Treason to Steer Themselves to Electoral Victory. The deception started long before Donald Trump." And, you know, I've talked about this before on this program, but I just, you know, thought it would be a good idea to just go through it all again. People are talking about the Republican Party and Donald Trump and his links to organized crime and, you know, calling him Teflon Don and, you know, all these scandals ranging from his interactions with foreign oligarchs to his attempt to kill tens of thousands of Americans by denying them health care, to his stepping up of the destruction of the environment and destruction of public lands by turning them over to petro-billionaires and oil mining interests. You know, he was not the first Republican president to commit high crimes in office or in order to get into office, to get and stay in office. In fact, Eisenhower was the last, in my opinion, the last legitimately elected president of the United States. Since he left the presidency in 1961, we have had 6 Republican presidents. And every single one of them, from Richard Nixon to Donald Trump, have been illegitimate, ascending to the highest office in the land, not through small d democratic elections, but instead through fraud and treason. Let's start with Richard Nixon. And you might want to pull up the audio of Nixon talking to Dirksen here. Richard Nixon in 1968 knew that Lyndon Johnson was desperately trying to end the war in Vietnam. And Johnson, LBJ, had gotten it to the point in the final months of October 1968 where the South Vietnamese had actually agreed. There was a ceasefire going on. It looked like it was holding. They were going to meet in Paris. They were going to make this thing happen. And Nixon's people reached out to the president of South Vietnam and said, don't go to the peace talks. Don't cooperate with President Lyndon Johnson or Vice President Hubert Humphrey. Don't do it. Wait until after the election and Richard Nixon will make you rich. And so the politicians of Vietnam said, cool, screw peace. And another 20,000 or so American soldiers died. Probably another million Vietnamese died. Cambodians and Laotians died. And in the end, it wasn't until the Jerry Ford presidency that we finally pulled out. And Lyndon Johnson learned about this. 3 days before the election, he learned about this, and he called up Everett Dirksen to say, Everett, oh my God, here, listen to this. This is Lyndon Johnson and Everett. Everett Dirksen, by the way, was the leader of the Republicans in the United States, arguably at that point. That, you had a Democrat in the White House. The Republicans in the Senate were led by Everett Dirksen. He was considered the wise old man of the Senate. He was very conservative, but not in the way that we would use that word today. He was not conservative like he's there for corporate interests. He was conservative like he was in favor of moving the country forward, but gradually. That's what conservative used to mean back in the 60s, or to a certain extent. He was a decent man, Everett Dirksen. And here he is, the number one Republican and the number one Democrat in America. This is the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, talking to Everett Dirksen, Senator Everett Dirksen.
Here's the latest information we got. The agent says that they just talked to the boss in New Mexico. And that he says that you must hold out. Just hold on until after the election. We know what Chew is saying to them out there. Yeah. We're pretty well informed on both ends. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. That's right. And they oughtn't to be doing this. This is treason. I know.
This is treason. I know. It's amazing. So Richard Nixon came to power through treason. He, with the peace talks would have caused people to say, oh, yeah, Humphrey, cool. He's going to bring peace. We'll vote for him. That was the big issue. Nixon was campaigning that he was going to end the war in Vietnam. He had a secret plan. Couldn't tell you. See, Trump said the same thing about ISIS. I got a secret plan. I can't tell you what it is. Because Trump's advisors, Roger Stone and all, they're all the old Nixon guys. So you've got Nixon, who came to power by treason, and you got Jerry Ford. Jerry Ford got selected by Richard Nixon to be his vice president because the vice president that was elected, Spiro Agnew, had been taking bribes when he was the governor of Maryland, and they'd finally caught up with him, and they were going to prosecute him while he was sitting in the White House as the vice president. So he resigned, and Nixon replaced him with Jerry Ford. Jerry Ford became president and pardoned Nixon and all of his buddies. And so Jerry Ford only was president because of Nixon's treason. He's also an illegitimate president. The next Republican president to come along was Ronald Reagan. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was way ahead. Everybody liked Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter was doing a pretty good job. The economy was a little soft, but it was largely the result of the Arab oil boycott. And Carter he was doing something about it. His famous speech where he said, the energy crisis is real and we're going to create this solar bank so that 20% of our nation's electricity is produced by solar power by the year 2000. He put solar panels on the roof of the White House. The thing that was hurting Carter was that a group of Iranian radicals, the so-called students, had taken 56 American hostages at the Iranian embassy after the Shah fell. And so the Reagan administration reached out to the Ayatollah and said, if you'll hang on to those hostages until after the election, this is the same game Nixon played. You'll hold on to the hostages until after the election, then we'll sell you weapons, even though it's completely illegal. And the Iranians really needed weapons from the United States because the Shah had been our ally and their entire military was all American-made stuff. And their planes needed spare parts, they needed tires, they needed replacement missiles, they needed everything. Their military was starting to fall apart because it was all American-made. And Reagan said, don't worry, we'll keep you going. Just keep the hostages so I get elected. And they did, and he was. And the president of Iran, Bani Sadr, wrote in an editorial for the Christian Science Monitor, he said, and I quote, I openly opposed the hostage-taking throughout the election campaign. I won the election with over 76% of the vote. Other candidates also were openly against hostage-taking. And overall, 96% of votes in that election were given to candidates who were against But the Ayatollah said, no, we can't do this because I cut a deal with the Reagans, with the Reagan campaign. And in fact, this is then Bonnie Sauter later on in the editorial in the Christian Science Monitors in 2013. He says, after arriving in France in 1981, I told a BBC reporter that I left Iran to expose the symbiotic relationship between Khomeiniism and Reaganism. Ayatollah Khomeini and Ronald Reagan had organized a clandestine negotiation known as the October Surprise, which prevented the attempts by myself and then U.S. President Jimmy Carter to free the hostages before the 1980 U.S. presidential election took place. The fact that they were not released tipped the results of the election in favor of Reagan. End of quote from the president of Iran at the time. And Reagan's treason, just like Nixon's treason, worked perfectly. Reagan took the oath of office, and literally, as he raised his hand, the Iranians let the hostages go. And Reagan, good to his word, started selling weapons to the Iranians right away, and that's what we call the the Iran-Contra scandal. So then Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, was elected because he was vice president to a guy who had committed treason to take the White House. So he was an illegitimate president. Which brings us to George W. Bush, who only got into office because his brother ordered the Secretary of State of Florida to knock 56,000 African Americans off the voting rolls 3 weeks before the election, so that his brother could get within spitting distance of winning the election. And still, he didn't win the state of Florida. They had to stop the count. They had to bring in the Supreme Court, 5 right-wingers on the Supreme Court to stop the count. Sandra Day O'Connor, I think to this day, regrets that vote. And that, of course, you know, that was George W. Bush, and now we've got Donald Trump. And there are many questions about his legitimacy, whether foreign governments were involved, whether the Russian government was involved, whether the oligarchs were involved. I'd say that the biggest thing is the oligarchs, you know, Mercer and the Kochs and all these guys, the billionaires behind him, and all the lies he told. You know, Trump said he was, you know, you go through the list, right? He was going to get money out of politics. He was going to stop. He was going to blow up the trade deals. He was going to bring back our jobs. He was going to protect Social Security.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Trump lied through his teeth at virtually every rally and continues to. Like I said, I got an email from him this morning filled with lies.